So in this next unit, we're going to be talking about ecology. And when we talk about ecology, what we're talking about is how organisms interact with their environment. And specifically, ecology is usually interested in two major things for any particular organism or group of organisms. Number one, where is it found geographically speaking? And this is also called its distribution. Number two, how many individuals occur there? And this is also called the abundance, or the number of individuals that occur in a particular place or part of the distribution of this organism. And then the sort of more complicated part of why does this particular distribution and abundance occur? And this is all about understanding the relationships of the organism with its environment and other organisms that it interacts with and other individuals within its population that it interacts with. And so, for example, you might look at the Shenandoah Mountain salamander, Plethodon virginia. And this particular salamander species exists only in Rockingham County and can only be found on one or two mountaintops in Shenandoah National Park. So to understand the ecology of this organism, you'd have to understand, number one, why is it found only there? Number two, how many individuals are there? And number three, why are we only seeing this many individuals and why is it only occurring on this mountaintop? And so when we talk about ecology, the sort of more formal definition is it's the study of how organisms interact with one another and with their physical environment. And when we say physical environment, we're talking about the non-living parts of the environment. And typically, ecologists study factors that influence the distribution and abundance of organisms. And when you're talking about those factors themselves that influence this distribution and abundance can be broken down into two major types of factors: abiotic factors and biotic factors. So we talk about abiotic factors, we're talking about the physical or non-living features. And so these can include things like your climate, like your temperature, or your rainfall, those sorts of things. You can be talking about the general availability of nutrients, so things like phosphorus, nitrogen, those major sort of limiting nutrients that can limit the ability of an organism to grow and thrive. And then the presence of geographical structures like mountains and oceans, all of that sort of stuff can have a big influence on climate and nutrient availability. And then you also have the biotic factors, and these are the biological living factors. So these can be things like diseases and pathogens. These can be things like the presence of other predator organisms, the production of resources by plants and other living organisms, and competition between individuals of either the same species or different individuals from different species. And all of these things, it's important to understand that they're not independent of one another. They're not mutually exclusive. They all interact with each other to determine what's called a species niche. And so a niche is just a complete description of the role that a species plays in its environment and of that species' requirements. So both the abiotic and biotic requirements that determine where that species can live in its abundance. And when we talk about niches, there's two sort of major types of niches that we can think about. There's a fundamental niche versus a realized niche. And so a fundamental niche essentially says, given these abiotic and sort of food resources that are available, this is the whole sort of habitat space that an organism can occupy, okay? So if we look at, for example, red-winged blackbirds, they tend to like these sort of pond, marshy areas, and you can't see it great, but behind here there's a marsh. And so this is the fundamental niche. This is the sort of habitat type that a red-winged blackbird in this particular area can potentially occupy. However, the fundamental niche doesn't always demonstrate the actual niche that we see in nature, because the fundamental niche oftentimes does not include species interactions with other species that are present in the environment. So when you add in other species that live in the environment, for example, these yellow-headed blackbirds, they're often better competitors in the deeper parts of a marsh, and so they can competitively exclude these red-winged blackbirds from that area. And so it turns out that the realized niche, in real life, so to speak, that we see for these blackbirds is only this little sort of ring in the shallow parts of the pond, because they don't occupy this deeper part because they're sort of excluded or stopped from occupying that pond by these yellow-headed blackbirds. So the realized niche is typically smaller than the fundamental niche. And when we talk about the level of organization that ecologists study, so getting back to the sort of big picture of what ecology is about, So if we look at the sort of major scales that we can look at for the organization of organisms or biology, we can go from molecules to organelles to cells to tissues to organs up to organ systems, all the way up to the biosphere, which is the entire planet Earth. And what ecologists study is really these three red areas. So they concentrate on organisms, individual organisms, populations of individual species, communities, which are groups of species in a particular place, and then ecosystems, which are the non-living components as well. So you can see like an individual elk, a population of elk, a community of organisms along with these populations of elk. You can also have moose and bobcats and rabbits and porcupines and owls, all in this sort of community of organisms and trees and plants. And then you can have this ecosystem that also includes the abiotic parts. And these are the four levels that ecology really concentrates on. So if we look at those levels of organization, once again, you can think of an organism as an individual represented by A. You can think of a population being defined of a group of individuals of the same species in the same area, so a bunch of those individual species A. You can think of a community as different populations living together in an area, so AAA is one species, then a population of species B and a population of species C, and then lastly an ecosystem is all of those communities in an area and the non-living components of the environment. So you can have all of these different populations of species along with the non-living component make an ecosystem. So why do we care about this? Why study ecology? Well, number one, it's necessary for human survival. So we talked a lot in the very first lectures about ecosystem services that are provided. So things like the production of food from forests and plants, the production of clean water and water filtration from forests and watersheds, production of clean air from forests. And when you take all of these ecosystem services and added them up, as Costanza et al. Did in their research paper, they found that all these ecosystem services provided services up to $33 trillion per year, which at the time, the global gross national product, so all of the sort of dollar value of every sort of economy in the world was worth about $18 trillion. So this is an invaluable service that maintains human life that's very difficult, if not impossible, to replace. And ecology also provides really important and useful tools to address major global challenges. So things like the disruption of nutrient cycling, deforestation, species extinctions, things like climate change and sea level rise, issues related to pollution like the depletion of the ozone layer from the release of chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs, and things like disease outbreaks and epidemiology. So understanding, for example, this idea of COVID, and that a lot of evidence supports that it may have been a zoonotic disease that was transferred from bats to humans. It's ecologists, population biologists, community biology, epidemiology. All of these things are tools that come from the field of ecology and understanding species interactions and how diseases spread between individuals and across different species. Another important part of studying ecology is that it helps it understand and address really complex problems. And nature can really serve as a guide. So because the living world has been around for much, much longer than we have, evolution has created some really elegant solutions, creative solutions to a lot of sort of problems. And these are just sort of cute examples that don't even necessarily fall under the areas of ecology, but they just provide examples of some of the great sort of solutions that evolution has provided, like burrs that are basically the precursor to creating Velcro. And so the guy who invented Velcro looked at burrs and how they work and how they have these little hooks at the end and how those are really good at latching onto things. And this is something that has evolved for the dispersion and dispersal of seeds. And that was basically transferred into Velcro. So by understanding this individual organism, we could make this really elegant invention like Velcro. And we're seeing this in a lot of other places. For example, people studying butterfly wings and the structure of butterfly wings and how they absorb light and reflect light have been able to apply that to solar panels to make them much more efficient. And there's lots of great examples of how nature has inspired engineering and design. And ecological systems are also great models for sustainability. So sustainability is a sort of hot term that's thrown around a lot these days. But sustainability is essentially defined as managing resources in a way that allows them to renew and support populations. So instead of pulling things out and extracting them in a way that they can't replace themselves, sustainability is all about using things in a way so that they can renew themselves. And a great example of this are sustainable agricultural practices that are based on sort of an evolutionary context for how these ecosystems and individual sort of plants and organisms interact with one another so that you can extract those resources in a way that allows the populations to build back up. Whether you're pulling fish from a population, whether you're cutting down trees, you're pulling them out in sustainable ways so that a population can replenish itself. And ecology has great tools to figure out how to do these things in a sustainable way. You can also make the argument that we have an ethical responsibility to study ecology and understand how ecosystems work. So how do we manage our actions that are changing the environment and altering the environment? How do we minimize some of the detrimental effects that these actions have? And how can we actually restore ecosystem functions and services so that future generations can enjoy the same sort of benefits that we've gotten from ecosystems? So basically what we're talking about are ecology, applying the tools of ecology for land management and ecosystem restoration. So what we want to avoid is bad land management where we deforest and use really extractive industrial processes and overgrazing to ultimately lead to the loss of biodiversity and the loss of sort of livelihoods. Instead, we want to try to have systems that are harvested sustainably, and try to invoke ecosystem restoration, where essentially what you're doing is you're using things like erosion control, soil restoration, and replanting to keep ecosystems intact and basically maintain livelihoods and extract resources in a sustainable way. An ecosystem, once again, has a lot of tools to contribute to these ideas. And lastly, I would argue curiosity. So there's really tons of really amazing organisms that are out there and interesting questions to address. And in the end, we're only going to conserve what we love, and we're only going to love what we understand. And ecology provides a great opportunity to study all of the interesting and amazing organisms that are out there. Different systems that ecologists look at, whether it's organisms, populations, communities, or ecosystems, as you increase in complexity, whether you're going from molecules to organelles all the way up to the biosphere, you really have an overall decreasing level of understanding of how each of these systems works. And I think, Yogi Berra said it best. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future, but you might replace future with populations, communities, and ecosystems. And so when we're trying to make predictions about how an organism or population or community or ecosystem will change or react to particular changes, it's very complex. And so one of the sort of major goals of ecology is to be able to have a good enough understanding of the patterns that exist at these different organizational levels to be able to make predictions about how they're going to react to different changes or perturbations. And this is especially relevant for something maybe like this. So these are an example of these sort of varmint hunts. And basically these are hunting competitions where contestants are given 24 hours to essentially go out and hunt or capture as many varmints as they can. So this may be coyotes, this may be bobcats, and there's huge prizes that are associated with killing these varmints. And so one question you might ask of these competitions is, are there effects of this? What are the effects of this? So obviously there's huge negative effects on the coyote populations or fox populations, but are there effects on other species in the overall ecosystem as well? And so once again, it's really tough to make predictions about this. And one of the fields that provides some tools to make predictions on the effects of this is community ecology. And so community, once again, are many populations of different species together in one place. So a community, here we're looking at this organizational level here, are populations of different species that overlap in time and space. And typically they have a long co-evolutionary history together. So this is in contrast to something like an invasive species or a non-native species that's introduced into a community that doesn't have a long co-evolutionary history with the species and populations in that community. So examples of communities might be a Central American rainforest or an Eastern hardwood forest or a Sonoran desert or the Alaskan tundra. In each of these examples, we have these sort of typical species that are typical to this sort of habitat type, and these different species have a long coevolutionary history together. And when we look at community interactions, oftentimes we use, or community colleges use a tool called food webs. Okay, so here's a very sort of simple food chain where you've got grasses that are fed on by these sort of mouse-like things called lemmings. So they have a direct negative effect on the grasses because they eat them, and the grasses have a direct positive effect on the lemmings because they provide nourishment for the lemmings. And the lemmings in turn are eaten by Arctic foxes. So they have a positive effect on the Arctic fox population, and the Arctic fox population in turn has a negative effect on the lemming population because they're eating them. So this is a very simplified, extremely simplified food chain. And you can add a little bit more complexity on top of this, where you might have a snowy owl or a snow goose that also interacts with the species. And so this is what's called a food web because it forms a web. And this is once again a very, very simplified food web. They're often much more, in real life, much, much more complex than this simplified version that we see right here. And so if you look at the interactions that are going on here, you can see that the lemming populations are also lowered by owls and foxes. And the owls and foxes, or I'm sorry, the foxes and owls both benefit by eating the lemmings. And the goose population is lowered by foxes, which eat the geese. But you can also see that there's some of these dotted arrows, and those represent what are called indirect interactions. And so here, for example, these geese can gain an indirect benefit from the snowy owl. So the snowy owls being present in this community has a positive effect on the geese, and that's because these snowy owls tend to scare away the Arctic foxes. So by scaring away the Arctic foxes lower this negative eating of the snow geese. And so because of that, there's an indirect positive effect that you see represented by this green arrow here of snowy owls on geese. And we also have geese gaining an indirect positive effect from lemmings, and that's because Arctic foxes actually have a preference for eating lemmings. So if lemmings are around in high abundance, Arctic foxes will eat more of the lemmings and eat fewer of the snow geese. So there's actually an indirect positive effect of these lemmings being around. And so this is all about understanding the sort of complex interactions that one individual organism in a food web can have on another. And so given that, what would you predict would happen if you removed snowy owls from this community? So go ahead and think about that for a minute, and you may want to just hit pause on your computer screen to give yourself some time to think about it. What do you think would happen if you remove snowy owls? Go ahead and think about that. Well, this was a bit of a trick question. Any of those choices, A, B, or C, could be correct. And it's actually extremely hard to make these kinds of predictions. And on top of that, it could be context dependent. So in other words, this community in one particular environment, if you remove snowy owls, might act one way. But if you did it in a different place, it might react a different way. And so in the end, you actually need experiments to establish what the effects are going to be. And so when we're going back to this sort of gory hunting competition that I talked about earlier, these varmint competitions, if we're going to understand what the effects of removing all these foxes and bobcats and coyotes from this community or from a place have on the community of organisms in there, we need to understand the food web, and we need to actually conduct rigorous experiments to explore what the effect of coyote removal or bobcat removal or foxes has on the rest of the community. So if we're going to answer this question, we need to use experiments, and that's what you guys are going to do for this case study activity.